Hello and welcome to this NET English Poetry talk-through for the AQA Power and Conflict Anthology. Now today I'm going to be walking you through the context and the content for London. Okay, let's start off with a quick reading of the poem. So, London. I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every ban, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear, and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Now, William Blake, who lived from 1757 to 1827, is usually classed as a romantic poet, although he was writing earlier than the main founding fathers of Romanticism, such as Wordsworth and Coleridge. Although he's now known best for his poetry, Blake was also an engraver, an illustrator and a printer, and his poems were always illustrated and intended to be engaged with visually as well as linguistically, and we'll cover more of that later. Now, in terms of his ideas and beliefs, Blake was a complex man. He lived in London throughout his life, but his literary focus and his philosophical explorations roamed across politics, morality, religion, and mysticism, constructing quite elaborate and complex systems of symbolism in his work. Blake was highly critical of the established church, but he was a devout Christian, claiming throughout his life to have he had this direct and personal experience of and contact with, he believed, with God, with angels, and with prophets, and with a direct sense of personal engagement, crucial in all his thinking. You need to get to grips with it yourself, rather than relying on the mediation or interpretation of others, Blake thought. Now, Blake was politically radical, sympathising with revolutionaries in both France and America, and possibly even taking part in rioting himself in the early 1780s. Blake's greatest sympathies, though, were with the poor and the oppressed in society, with a particular focus on the negative social impact of inequality on women and children. London, as a poem, is taken from what later became one of Blake's most famous poetry collections, Songs of Experience, published in 1794. The collection focuses on the negative, corruptive, and damaging impact of what Blake saw as the fallen world, on the natural innocence of children and on humanity more widely, the imposition of helplessness, of fear and restriction, and the ultimate expression of that fallen world in terms of the social, political, and religious systems that impose, reinforce, and propagate those inequalities in society. Now, it's worth thinking about the resonances of London as a location. At the time of Blake's writing, London was the capital city of the United Kingdom, and by extension, the centre of the growing British Empire. London was an international financial hub, and it was the focus of urbanisation and expansion in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, becoming the largest city in the world for much of the 19th century. Blake's London was, however, also the location to which many of the displaced rural population had been drawn, and that rapid growth had exacerbated the problems with which any urban setting has to contend. It was plagued with crime, with poverty, with squalor, with outbreaks of various diseases throughout the 18th century, often resulting from the poor living conditions, and leading then to very high rates of mortality, particularly among infants and children. In a sense, London symbolised British society. It was the seat of government, of learning, of monarchy, of military pageantry, of religion, but it was also the beating heart of political dissidence, of religious evangelism, of artistic exploration, and of the imposed exploitative inequalities that were being exported to the wider world through trade and the expansion of the empire. A visitor to London could walk past magnificent cathedrals and the towering grandeur of palaces, and within moments be threading their way through stinking slums, stepping over and through the city's refuse, both literally and metaphorically. Now, this is the city that Blake's narrator is walking around, is in a sense guiding us round. Now, the poem is structured almost as a walking tour of the city, maintaining a steady iambic, that ti-tum rhythm throughout, and supported also by the consistent A-B rhyme scheme that runs throughout the stanzas. We begin with Blake's narrator wandering, apparently aimlessly, through each chartered street near the chartered Thames. Chartered here suggests ownership, control, particularly, presumably, by the wealthier middle and upper classes. Note also that it's the street and the Thames that are being owned and controlled, spaces that are about movement, freedom and connection, linked to the verbs wander and flow. Instead, the poor are being excluded, they're being limited, with these artificial boundaries being imposed, perhaps even with a resonance to do with maps and the arbitrary nature of some geopolitical borders. The narrator shifts from spaces to faces, marking the marks of weakness and the marks of woe, with mark used to mean both notice and also the physical signs of weakness and woe. Now, these could simply be emotional indicators, but they're likely to also refer to the physical impact of vice and immorality, whether that be the consumption of alcohol, the impact of violence, or even of sexually transmitted infections, and by extension, by the physical exploitation of the working class. To begin with, at least, these faces are anonymous. There's no sense in stanza 1 of gender, of age. The suffering is universal, and these individuals are not viewed by this class-structured society as mattering as people. Now, there's a sensory shift in the second stanza from the sight focus of stanza 1, look around you, Blake seems to be saying, to the idea of hearing in stanza 2, and now it's this idea of listening. Blake uses the repeated structure of the in every to emphasize the constant and repetitive nature of the cries he hears, from the theoretically powerful and independent men to the smallest and most vulnerable infants. Cry here suggests both emotional distress and a plea for help. They're literally crying out to us. There's also the escalation to the third line of the stanza, where in every is repeated twice to emphasize the increasing impact of the imposed bans on every voice, linking back to the every face from stanza 1, and also to the chartered street and the chartered Thames. Bans are, again, an imposed control. The key line from the second stanza, though, is the final one. Blake's description of the mind-forged manacles. Now, manacles are an image with a number of important resonances. They're associated with imprisonment and criminality, seen at the time as a problem of the working class, but they're also linked with slavery. And there was a frequent connection made among those politically protesting between the literal enslavement of people, largely from Africa, and what was seen as the de facto slavery of the poor and needy. What's manacling people here, though, is mind-forged, is an imprisonment by and of ideas. For Blake, institutions such as the monarchy, the aristocracy, the legal system and the church imprison people both spiritually and socially. Know your place, accept your place, do not question, these systems teach us. Even more pervasive, though, is the extent to which these limitations, having been externally imposed, become internalized, where the beliefs and the ideas that restrict people become shackles that they accept and impose on themselves. In the third stanza, Blake then lists what he sees as these mind-forged manacles. We had the chimney sweeper's cry that appalls the blackening church. There's the hapless soldier, the palace walls. Now, chimney sweepers were a key political and social issue. Master sweeps would employ young boys, often orphans as young as 4, to climb the narrow chimneys and dislodge the soot. In the flue, they would become trapped, they could suffocate, they could burn to death. And that's not even to engage with the long-term impact of their trade, including physical deformity, poor growth, loss of sight, asthma, and scrotal cancer. Now, the last of those was common enough to be known as chimney sweep cancer. And these children, unpaid, were entirely at the mercy of the adult chimney sweepers, who kept them, sent them out each day to shout, to cry on the streets, to advertise their services. These children, for Blake, represent the problems in society. They're unsupported, they're uncared for, they're trapped, they're exploited, they're suffering, and they're losing their childhood innocence, their opportunity, and their lives. Now the church, notice, is described as blackening, both literally becoming darker through the industrial pollution and the filth of the city, and also becoming increasingly morally indefensible. It's a supporter and propagator of immorality rather than a challenger of it. Now the church, of course, was enormously powerful and had become enormously wealthy, preaching stability to the population. Again, this idea of know your place, do not question, do not challenge. Blackening leaves open as to whether Blake sees the church as simply becoming darker, as in it's getting worse, or as being the actual cause of the darkness. Either way, Blake's view is clear. It's appalling. Soldiers are also seen by Blake as victims in society. With the legacy of the 7 Years' War, the American Revolutionary War, and later the Revolutionary Wars, visible on the streets, in terms of physically traumatized, psychologically traumatized, and crippled ex-soldiers struggling to survive, there was very limited support available for them, financial or otherwise. The men are hapless, they're unlucky or unfortunate, but the image attached to them of their sigh running in blood down palace walls is quite ambiguous. It suggests, obviously, that their bloody sacrifice in the service of an uncaring monarchy, symbolized by the physical building of the palace, just as organized religion is symbolized through the physical building of the church. Yes, but it also implies a threat. The French Revolution had begun in 1789, and Blake and many other political radicals and dissidents watched its progress with early optimism, and then increasingly with a sense of slightly sympathetic horror, as early hope led to violence and suffering. Beware, Blake seems to be saying. This could happen in England as well. And it's not entirely clear that Blake and those who like him would see that as a negative. Just as a side note, it's worth pointing out that the third stanza contains an acrostic. The second stanza ends with the verb here, and the first letter of each line of the third stanza spells this out as essentially an imperative: how, every, and runs. And that spells here. Blake's key message here is unambiguous. Listen. The final stanza, unsurprisingly, draws Blake's ultimate message together. The streets are now midnight, both literally and metaphorically at their darkest, implying that what is described in this stanza is the worst that Blake can see in society. There's the youthful harlot's curse, Blake notes, with interpretation open as to whether this simply refers to the offensive language of the harlot, and that's either someone sexually exploited or a literal prostitute, and thus to a lack of education, opportunity, a lack of social integration, a lack of respect, or, more probably, that curse refers to the spread of sexually transmitted diseases. Notice that the harlot is described with the adjective youthful. Being young is associated by Blake with freedom, with vitality, with opportunity, with innocence. Here, it's been exploited, been corrupted, it's been degraded. And the curse, in turn, blasts the newborn infant's tear. It's possible to interpret this as the suffering and sorrow of the infants, the babies, being met with cruelty, being met with curses, rather than with kindness. But blasts also refers to where something infects or damages a plant, an external parasitic presence limiting the natural growth of the plant. In this interpretation, the mother's context is being passed on to the child, the cycle of ignorance, of exploitation, and of suffering, but also the sexually transmitted infections the mother carries being passed on through the birth itself. Now, gonorrhea, most probably, was widespread at the time, was contracted during the birth, and led to babies being born with eyes that oozed pus uncontrollably, and that led to eventual blindness. these natural buds, the children, are being eaten away by an external influence, by the venereal disease. Blasts and blights are linked through the alliteration, and they're also linked in this final stanza to the plagues and the marriage hearse. The final image of the poem is, or should be, oxymoronic. Marriage is, socially and religiously, about love, about unification, about life. Instead, here it's about death. Plagues has a clear biblical resonance. Think Moses and the plague sent to punish the Egyptians. And it's also linked to that lingering sense of a divine punishment for social immorality. And that's a common idea linked to the outbreaks of disease from the 14th century onwards. A hearse, after all, was used to transport dead bodies. And it's not the kind of thing, not the kind of vehicle that you would typically associate with a wedding. For Blake, marriage is literally killing people, since it leads to the spreading of diseases from men who've exploited the youthful harlots to their innocent wives and the children who then suffer as a result. But marriage itself can also be viewed as dying as a result of all this. It's both the cause and the consequence. Obviously, we're analysing the poem simply as words, but it's worth commenting briefly on the illustration that accompanied it. And the illustration depicts an elderly man being led by a small child. Old men like this, in Blake's illustrations, often symbolise rationality or reason without emotion or inspiration, while children represent, unsurprisingly, vitality, inspiration, innocence, emotion. Children, Blake seems to be suggesting, can offer us hope, can offer life, redemption, but we need to be led by them, to see them as examples to be protected and valued and nurtured, rather than as victims to be ignored or as resources to be exploited. Now, in terms of building comparisons within the AQA anthology, the focus on the city and on childhood make this quite an easy comparison to the émigré, especially with the contrast in terms of the perspectives adopted. But there's also a focus on the group and the individual and on permanence and transience that could link to something like Tissue, to Ozymandias, perhaps even to Storming Islander Exposure, or to War Photographer or even Poppies, in terms of the impact of wider events on individuals and on the suffering of innocence. That would also perhaps link to the idea of mental restriction, of indoctrination and propaganda that we can see in poems such as Checking Out My History or in terms of Kamikaze. Thank you very much for listening. Now, don't forget that there's a range of other videos on the Power and Conflict poetry and on all the other GCSE topics in terms of English. And you can find those on the NET English YouTube channel, which is www.youtube.com/NET English 1.